And speaking of obvious scams, that gets me to our latest update on the Leaving Neverland movie from HBO, which I have been immersed in for the last several weeks, never anticipating that would be the case, but through a bizarre series of circumstances, I have been. And I have to say that it's amazing how many things have occurred since HBO broadcast that movie. I don't call it a documentary because it's not. It's clearly not. It's a work of fiction. And this week is no exception. In last week's podcast, I mentioned that something has to be up with Oprah Winfrey, that Oprah Winfrey has to be part of what's really going on here, that the reason why Oprah was brought in to do an hour, quote-unquote, post-game show, as I called it, for this movie involving two allegations of sex abuse against Michael Jackson, made by James Safechuck and Wade Robson. The reason why Oprah was brought in is that they knew they needed a heavy hitter. They knew they needed some media protection. They needed to effectively have her give her blessing as a sex abuse victim who's a media darling to Safechuck and Robson, because if that didn't happen, I think they were smart enough to realize they were going to get destroyed. They were going to get destroyed not just because Michael Jackson has a huge worldwide fan base, but because the facts weren't on their side. And the only way that they could survive this is if the media was afraid to attack the movie. They could not survive an onslaught from a factual standpoint because the story is ridiculous and contradicted in many, 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 many ways. Legally, logically, every which way. It just doesn't hold water. So the only way you survive that kind of situation is if everyone is afraid to attack you. And if Oprah is on board, then no one will attack you, at least not in the American media, because she is untouchable. And once you have her blessing, you have a halo on. You have a force field. And with that kind of force field protection, especially on the issue of child sex abuse, nobody in the American media, especially post-Me Too, is going to have the balls, except maybe John Ziegler and a couple other people, to say, hold on a second, this is bullcrap. No one is going to do that. And I theorized last week that there had to have been some sort of a quid pro quo here. Not like in a conspiratorial way. That's not the way the real world works. But, Oprah Winfrey was shown this movie on her birthday on David Geffen's yacht. This is a matter of public record. They tweeted about it. And then, of course, she becomes a huge part of holding this whole thing together. Well, I said last week, some project is going to come forward with Oprah that's involved with this. She's going to get something out of this. Well, this week it was announced that she's going to be doing 2 documentary series for Apple in conjunction with Steven Spielberg. Well, who is Steven Spielberg's partner? David Geffen. David Geffen is also a huge shareholder in Apple. Now, none of this proves anything, but it's about as close as you're going to get to, aha, bum, 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 now we understand. And the Jackson family, very early on when I was speaking to them, they were incensed about Oprah, but they were also very skeptical about what was really going on here politically, that they felt like this was a political hit job. Now, that's against my DNA to presume that, but I'm starting to think that there's something to that. Again, not in a real dark conspiratorial way, just in a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours sort of way. And since Michael Jackson is dead, no one feels like he's of any value to them. So if he's not of value to them, like if Michael Jackson was still alive, Oprah wouldn't be doing this. One, because the law is different with regard to defamation, but also Michael Jackson would still have some value, doing an interview with him or whatever. But once you're dead, especially for 10 years, that's gone. There's nothing in it for you. So now there's some indication, and I think the Oprah, the Michael Jackson fans have been a little bit overly optimistic about this. That Oprah, there's this narrative on Twitter that she has backed away from Leaving Neverland because a lot of the videos that she had up on her social media accounts regarding Leaving Neverland have been deleted or erased or what have you. I'm not necessarily certain that that's what's going on here. It could be. that's certainly not enough for me to conclude that she has backed away from leaving Neverland. I would need a statement from her saying, I regret taking part in this, or I now question whether or not this project was credible, or something along those lines. Unless and until she makes a public statement, to me, getting rid of social media posts is not going to do it for me. I mean, that doesn't do it. Now, maybe that's her intention, but I don't know how in the world you cover your tracks at this point. She did an hour-long special on HBO about this, which is still up on HBO On Demand. So unless that gets taken down, then I'm not necessarily buying that she is consciously backing away from leaving Neverland. Is she even aware of all these things that have been learned about the film and how absurd its narrative is, and how all the clear, obvious, factual inaccuracies there are? I don't know, because she's living in a bubble. I doubt very seriously that she's checking Twitter and saying, well, look, what is John Ziegler writing about this, or somebody else writing about this? Now, interestingly, in the UK, some of the UK tabloids have definitely shifted their tone on this. They are now openly questioning the entire essence of the film Leaving Neverland. And they're doing so on a very factual basis. And this week there were two things that we learned which in a rational world should torpedo an enormous portion of the credibility of the film. Now, as I've said many, many times on this issue of child sex abuse, the threshold and the burden of proof are so absurdly high, that it's almost impossible to overcome them, because the other side will always be able to rationalize some way to make sure that the square peg fits in the round hole, or vice versa. It's incredibly frustrating. I have likened this to the global warming people. It doesn't matter what happens with regard to climate or weather, it's irrelevant, because it's always consistent with global warming. It's the same way with child sex abuse. Once you've determined that child sex abuse has occurred, even without evidence, every piece of evidence fits into that, no matter what it is. Well, these two pieces of evidence, though, are difficult to make work. And one deals with Wade Robson, who to me is so obviously lying, it's almost not even worth talking about. He's the person whose girlfriend was Michael Jackson's niece, Brandy, who we interviewed on this podcast several weeks ago, which you can check out at freespeechbroadcasting.com. And this week it came to our attention that Wade Robson in the movie claims that he was abused by Michael Jackson for several days at Leaving Neverland while his family was on vacation in the Grand Canyon. Now, right off the bat, that sounds a little weird, that you just leave your young son with Michael Jackson at the Neverland Ranch while you go off as a family to the Grand Canyon. Not just from a responsibility standpoint, but this is the family event to go to the Grand Canyon. You do that once in your life. These people are from Australia. You do that once. You're going to leave your young son at home? He's not going to make the trip? That doesn't make a lot of sense. But that's not the nature of the revelation. The nature of the revelation is that Joy Robson, who we talked a lot about last week on the podcast, and her being part of a pro-Michael Jackson fan club way past May of 2013, when Robson went on the Today Show to declare that he was an abuse victim of Michael Jackson, and she's liking Facebook posts and now unliking them after we exposed that she's part of these groups. Joy Robson has testified not once, but twice, over an extended period of time, under oath, that Wade Robson went with them on that Grand Canyon trip. She has testified under oath twice. The mom, with no incentive to lie about that. None. That Wade Robson, as logic would dictate, went with them on the Grand Canyon trip. So this is something that Wade just simply made up, and that his mom is now going along with. Why? Well, because there could be a very large pot of gold at the end of this false allegation rainbow. But that's, as strong as that should be in a rational world, that's not as good as what we learned this week about James Safechuck. And this is really interesting on a number of levels, because here I am, the ultimate skeptic, that it's almost impossible to get anybody on the other side of this argument to accept that a story is bullcrap, and yet it's effectively happened just within the last couple of hours, mainly because the director of this movie, Dan Reed, made a colossal mistake, one of many, because he just clearly didn't research his subjects. But here's the essence of this story. James Safechuck, the other accuser of Michael Jackson, in the movie claims very clearly and very matter-of-factly that as part of what he described as his honeymoon period with Michael Jackson, that's how he described it. Like this was them in their, we were having sex all the time stage because we were new young lovers, which doesn't even make any damn sense because he's pre-pubescent at this point, so he doesn't even have theoretically a large sex drive, and so I mean, you don't even want to think about that. But these are the things that you just have to forget about in order to buy this ridiculous narrative. But okay, this is what he says. This is his claim. So we have to take his claim seriously. And his claim is that one of the main places where he was abused consistently during this so-called honeymoon period as a young boy occurred in the train house that Michael Jackson had constructed at Neverland. There was a room above the, Michael Jackson, you've probably seen him, you've seen pictures of the Neverland Ranch. There's a train. And of course, there's a train house, which is like the central point of where the train, you get on and off the train, right? And above the train house, there's a room. So it's a 2-story building. And James says that that's where Michael Jackson would take him to abuse him. Says it very matter-of-factly. Okay. Well, James says, and it's important to point out, James has said this under oath during his own lawsuit against the Jackson estate, that the abuse against him by Michael Jackson ended in 1992 when he was about 14 years old. All right? That's a little old, by the way, considering that a large portion of the narrative here is that Michael Jackson got rid of these guys once they hit puberty. And both Wade and James, James especially, neither of them, there's any indication that they hit puberty late. But James is a large guy. And I've seen pictures of him at 15 and 16, and he's much larger than Michael Jackson. So it's not like we have got a super late puberty situation here. But so 14 always seemed a little late based upon the narrative they were trying to create, that, Michael Jackson likes you as a prepubescent boy, but as soon as you hit puberty, he's on to some other boy to molest, even though those other boys say nothing happened. But okay, but let's go back to the dates, because dates are always very important in these cases, and it's interesting how accusers never like to talk about dates. I found that in all these cases. Dates are like kryptonite to these kind of accusations. So his abuse ends in 1992. Well, what's really interesting about this train house is that we have voluminous evidence that the train house wasn't even begun to be constructed until the fall of 1993, and that in all likelihood did not actually exist as a structure until sometime in mid-1994. So now we're at least 2 years after James Safechuck claims that his abuse, under oath, his abuse by Michael Jackson has ended. Now, in a rational world, that's a bum. That's flat out lie, right? That's your whole story is now discredited. However, I'm well aware we don't live in a rational world in these kind of allegations. And when this was discovered on Twitter by a bunch of very proficient Michael Jackson fans, and once again, the Michael Jackson fans, I got to say, are amazing in so many different ways. But, this was confirmed in numerous ways, through photographs, through the construction permits. This wasn't just some one idle photograph that might have been misidentified. This was as proven as could possibly be. And I was skeptical. I said, look, I believe it, and I believe that this proves James is lying, which I already pretty much knew he was. But in the world we're living in, this is Alice in Wonderland. Here's what's going to happen. The other side is going to say, well, James just misunderstood, or he misremembered where he was abused because of all the trauma that he experienced. It's the trauma. It's post-traumatic stress disorder. So he's misremembering where he was abused. That's what I presumed was going to be the response. Well, Dan Reed, apparently, the director of this movie, is too much of a moron to realize that that's the script you're supposed to be working on off of when you are in favor of false allegations of abuse. Because this morning on Twitter, Dan Reed actually responded, much to my shock. Dan Reed actually responded to this issue of, wait a minute, the train station didn't even exist in the form that James said it did until at least 2 years after he says his abuse ended. It's also important to point out, by the way, that even by the time that the train station is constructed in a way that is consistent with James and his claims in the movie, Michael Jackson wasn't even living there. And he was married to Lisa Marie Presley. So there's so many problems, even if you accept that somehow, okay, maybe it was 1994 and not 1992, as James said in the movie and under oath in his lawsuit. So I'm expecting that Dan Reed is either just going to pretend that this doesn't exist, or he's going to say that James was never really abused in the train house and he just forgot and he misremembered over the years, and it was the trauma that caused him, and maybe he imagined he was abused there in a dream or something. That's the way you go, because that's the way no one can actually pin you down. Even though it's absurd, that's the way that I expected Dan Reed was going to respond. Either no response at all, or he was going to do the BS, faulty memory thing. Instead, Dan Reed tweets, quote, "Yeah, there seems to be no doubt about the station date. The date they have wrong is the end of the abuse." Oh, my God. Wow. Okay. All right, Dan Reed. In a rational, logical world, you have just made it game, set, match for your film. Because now what you're saying is, okay, I'm willing to accept that the train station where James says he was abused didn't exist until 1994-ish. But now he's claiming that James was abused at the train station. And the earliest that can happen is 1994. Well, there's a massive problem with that. Forgetting the fact that Michael wasn't living there and he's married now. Here's the biggest problem. Now James is at least 16 years old. And he's huge. We have pictures of him. Which is another lie, by the way. James claims that Michael Jackson, in the movie, that Michael Jackson broke up with him and abandoned him. Well, yet there's pictures of James Safechuck at all sorts of Michael Jackson events, holding umbrellas and being his assistant. And James Safechuck is huge. He's much larger than Michael Jackson at that age of 16. But here's the bigger problem. The entire narrative of the first half of the film is that Michael Jackson likes these prepubescent boys and gets rid of them once they hit puberty, and that James and Wade felt crushed because he broke up with them. That's the essence of the whole movie. The whole movie, that's the essence. Well, now Dan Reed, instead of going with the James's memory is faulty, has acknowledged that, one, James is still lying under oath about when the abuse ended. Still, even after he's come forward as an abuse victim, because he said under oath unequivocally it was 1992. Now we're well into 1994. So that's a problem in the rational world. But the bigger problem is he's 16 and he's huge. He's way past puberty. The whole narrative of this movie is Michael Jackson likes prepubescent boys and gets rid of them once they hit puberty. Why and how in the world is James Safechuck still being abused by Michael Jackson, who's now married, not living at Neverland, somehow in late 1994? That's absurd. It's ridiculous, and that is as much of a smoking gun as you're going to get that the whole movie is a lie. And that Dan Reed didn't do his due diligence. He didn't do his research. There was no vetting here. And Dan Reed has finally cracked under all the pressure that he's under. Because this was an unforced error. I am stunned that he even responded, and I'm stunned that he didn't go with the trauma caused James to misremember where he was abused excuse. Because that you can't fight. But this one, no one's going to buy this. Nobody is buying that, oh yeah, you've just decided in order to salvage the train station story, now you're making James Safechuck 16 years old and huge and being abused by Michael Jackson against his own testimony, both in the movie and under oath. Sorry, not buying. It's absurd. Now, will this mean anything? I don't know. I have been very skeptical all along that this is a battle that can be won from my experiences with the Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky case, because the deck is stacked against you in a huge way. But there is no question that the facts here are so on the side of Michael Jackson and against leaving Neverland. And because the estate has so much money and because they do have a lawsuit against HBO, although it's not directly about the allegations, I guess they could bring those in, and I certainly think they're going to try to get the outtakes from Leaving Neverland, which will, I think, blow apart the whole scam that was the movie. So I do think that there's a chance that this thing could be blown apart and the narrative could be dramatically altered. I still question, unless Oprah changes her mind, whether or not the media, the news media, especially in America, will ever allow that to happen, because they've invested enough in here that I don't think that they're ever going to change the narrative. Again, unless Oprah changes her mind. If Oprah changes her mind, then it's all over. So Dan Reed ought to be very nice to Oprah. That's for sure, because Oprah in one snap of a finger could destroy Dan Reed forever. And, hell hath no fury like an Oprah scorned. So that, I think, is the best shot. Oprah is the best shot here, because she might still have some incentive to start questioning this movie, because she's going to lose some fan base over this. How much, I don't know. But people have looked at this. It is overwhelmingly ridiculous. The whole thing is absurd. It's almost like this, and this is what fascinates me about this story. It's almost like the unstoppable force against an immovable object. And what I mean by that is, if you think of truth as this unstoppable force, which unfortunately it no longer is. We don't live in that world anymore. Look who's president of the United States. But in theory, if truth is an unstoppable force, the truth is so on the side of Michael Jackson and his supporters here. And yet you have this unstoppable force of Oprah Winfrey and sex abuse victims having been sanctified by the news media, where they're not going to budge. And those two things are going to collide, and are colliding in a huge way. Which side's going to win? I think the truth has a shot here, but I'm still betting on the unstoppable force based upon my Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky experience. Although there are different circumstances, it's still basically the same movie.